Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger, and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's April 1st, 2021, and we're looking at something which could have been passed off as an April Fool's joke, except that it's so serious. Namely, the State Department has come out with their annual human rights report, and this one is just filled with lies and provocations against China in their coverage of Xinjiang. How do you see this report, Helga?
I think it's a very serious matter because to accuse another country of genocide, I mean, that puts it on the more or less on the same level like the Nazis who did commit genocide. So there's a very serious accusation. It's all the more serious when it's a complete lie. Uh, I mean, first of all, the Schiller Institute has studied the matter since many years. We had members of the Schiller Institute from two different countries, from France and from the United States, going to Xinjiang and investigating the matter. And they, as well as many diplomats from many countries, came back with reports saying that this is absolutely not true. What has happened is that, one of the poorest parts of China, which had Han, Chinese, and Uyghurs and other minorities, has been consciously transformed in the last several years after some terrorism did occur more than 10 years ago. Uh, and it was developed. There was a certain amount of training on the jobs. People got educations, even university educations. And now that part of China is in a optimistic move forward, like most of the rest of China. Now, to say this, and to say genocide when it is a fact that the Uyghur population in the last years has increased by a vast number, a higher ratio of increase than any other ethnic group, including the Han Chinese. So, the scientific definition of genocide is if there is an effort to eliminate a whole part of the population based on their ethnicity, on their, ethnical roots. And this is not happening. The opposite is happening. The Uyghurs in Xinjiang are living a content life. Now, this is a serious matter, and therefore, I do not put it in the in the category of human rights issues, but I put it in the category of destabilization of China. And I think that that is exactly what is at stake. And I think the spokeswoman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Hua uh, Chunying, in a recent press statement, showed a video of the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, the former U.S. Secretary of State, who was, giving the famous or infamous speech which led or was the introduction to the war against Iraq in 2003, which, as we now know, was based on conscious lies. And I think Wilkerson even said at one point that Colin Powell knew ahead of time that there were no weapons of mass destruction, as did Pelosi. Pelosi sometimes, I think a year ago, said, yeah, yeah, we all knew it. We were all briefed there were no weapons of mass destruction. So it's one of these lies. The lie about Xinjiang is a lie like the lies about the weapons of mass destruction uh, in Iraq. And I think, if you look what Colin Powell said in this video, he said, well, one of the reasons why the United States is in Afghanistan is because the CIA knows that there are 20 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and we can use them to destabilize China from the inside rather than, having the trouble to destabilize it from the outside. So what we are looking at is a completely different operation which I think is really important to get out, because otherwise this is potentially one of the things which could lead to very serious consequences.
And Helga, is it your assessment that this goes back to, in particular in recent years, Brzezinski's arc of crisis, which is a classic example of British geopolitics, destabilizing China and Russia from the Southern Crescent?
Yes, the interesting thing is, that this Brzezinski policy was already formulated in 75. He presented that to the Trilateral Commission to a meeting in Tokyo at that time to play the so-called Islamic card against the Soviet Union. Now, this is very important because it was only in 79, that is 4 years later, that the Soviet Union attacked Afghanistan. And it was then based on that Brzezinski policy that the West, the United States and others, started to train the Mujahideen. And they created really through that the very radical form of Islam, which then in the following years and decades would lead to Al-Qaeda and all of these ISIS and all these phenomena. So it was really the policy of the West which catalyzed this problem. And in the 70s, the Mujahideen were trained, with modern weapons, with lots of money. And then when the Soviet Union basically went out of Afghanistan, of not being able to win that war in about 10 years, all of these networks spread throughout the whole region to Pakistan, to what became the former republics of the Soviet Union, to Xinjiang. And, they remained a permanent factor of destabilization. And we should not forget that it was General Flynn who tried to go to Obama in 2012, telling him, why is the United States supporting these Al-Qaeda networks? Why are we working with the same people we claim were responsible for 9/11 and the deaths of 3,000 people around the attack on the World Trade Center? Now, these are inconsistencies, or rather blatant lies of American policy, which I think need to be discussed because of the reasons I just said. So the Uyghur problem has been dealt with in a very good way, because China decided that they would give these people who were in the terrorist milieu, to give them a chance to, acquire a good profession, to get training, to have a family. And so therefore they were able to stop the problem of terrorism through development. If you contrast that with what the United States has done in throwing bombs on Iraq, on Syria, on many other places, I think that the Chinese way of dealing with it is much more human. And I think anybody who has any honesty should really not repeat these lies, because that they are exactly that, and they are warmongering and an effort to destabilize an existing country, which is very dangerous, because if you're doing that to the a nuclear power, which happens to be also in an alliance with Russia, this could lead to very serious consequences down the road.
And if the State Department is serious about investigating human rights violations and genocide, it should take a look at the US policy, which, as you say, has led to destruction and killing, especially now with the sanction policy. We just had Colonel Black describe this at a Schiller Institute conference as the sanctions which are killing people in Syria. He said this is the most barbaric form of war. You've followed this very closely. What's your sense of whether this is getting out, the story is getting out now?
Yes, because sanctions, obviously, they normally have the worst effect on the poorest part of the population. It leads to lack of medicine, lack of, important food supplies. And in the case of Syria, you can see the horrible consequences of that, that after 10 years of war, which, was, let's be very clear, I mean, this war against Syria was part of the regime change, which was supposed to topple and kill Saddam Hussein, which killed Gaddafi, and the next in line was Assad. So this is, the narrative about what happened in Syria is really another one of these lies. And now, as a result of 10 years of war, in which, this is a whole subject for another program, in addition to the COVID and the sanctions, have created a situation where, according to the Catholic Cardinal of Syria, Cardinal Mario Zenari, he just issued an absolute passionate warning that 90% of the population in Syria is below the absolute poverty line, that, they have not enough food, they have not enough medical supply. And, this borders genocide if you keep up the sanctions under these circumstances. And then there was this so-called donor conference in Brussels just now. Okay, Germany gave 1.7 billion euros, which is not nothing, but the money which was requested by the UN or said was necessary was not matched. But, again, the German government, there Mr. Maas, in his infinite wisdom, quote, basically said that they will only participate in the reconstruction of Syria after Assad would be gone, or some major political changes are there, which comes down to the same thing. Who will be the government is entirely the decision of the Syrian people. And, I think that I can only ask people to read what this Cardinal Zenari said, and, help to bring a change in the attitude towards Syria. And we should get people to understand that peace, what he said, by the way, not only that 90% of the people are in grave danger, but he said there will be no peace unless there is economic development. And that is the most important message, which we have been saying for a long time, that you need peace through development. You need a reconstruction, not only of Syria, of Yemen, where the situation is equally dire. 20 million people are in danger there. We need a reconstruction of Southwest Asia immediately, and anybody who is of goodwill should cooperate with the Schiller Institute and the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites, which is trying to get these changes going. So please contact us if you agree that some change must occur.
And I think we should make it clear that the sanctions policy in Syria was escalated on the way out the door by Secretary of State Pompeo from the Trump administration. And Biden's Secretary of State Blinken just endorsed them before the United Nations in a really chilling statement. The same Blinken, by the way, Helga, is now escalating on the Nord Stream pipeline, isn't he?
Yes, when he was in Brussels, it was reported that he met with Maas, the German foreign minister, on the sidelines, and they discussed Nord Stream 2. And lo and behold, and I said, let's watch that. Let's see if people have any kind of backbone. And lo and behold, a person with the name of, let me check because he's not so famous, Peter Bayer. He is the transatlantic coordinator of Germany. So he came out now and said, we should have a moratorium on the Nord Stream 2 because we are urgent in need for a repair of the transatlantic relations. Give me a break. Why is the transatlantic relationship in need of a repair? Because of anything Germany did? Obviously, because of the America First policy. The situation has gotten really very sour because of that. The unwillingness of the US administration to sell any vaccines when Germany, for example, clearly has a big problem with that. So the transatlantic relationship is not in need of repair because of Germany. and I think the idea to have a moratorium, argued that way is just completely ludicrous. I can only hope that enough people in Germany and the 12 other countries which are involved on the European side have enough backbone to understand that, this energy situation in Germany is not such that we can afford that. We are still in danger of having a blackout, and if this insanity of the Great Reset and the Green Deal and all of these things go on, not only will the energy prices skyrocket, but we will have the danger of blackouts with unforeseeable consequences. So I think it's a question of the very deep national interest of Germany and European countries to go ahead with this pipeline and not be such a, this behavior is just, I don't want to use words which I would regret afterwards, but people can fill out the dots themselves.
Well, and as we're looking at this question of anti-human policies, violations of human rights, we've had reports with the committee you set up of the effect of triage in especially hospitals in poor areas and areas of African American communities. This is a very serious threat given the spread of the third or fourth wave of COVID.
Yes, the situation with the COVID obviously is out of control. In Brazil, health experts have put out warnings that Brazil is becoming a global threat simply because, many new strains develop. There is total chaos because of Bolsonaro's absolutely irresponsible policy. But this is not the only situation which is out of control. The figures are going up in the United States. In Germany, there is, despite the fact that you would think that a country like Germany should be able to deal with it, figures are going up again. And, there were headlines again saying, if there is not a break by end of April, we could be in a situation where, again, the question is, whom can we treat and who not, coming from the doctors. Now, that is another way of describing triage. And, at our recent Schiller Institute conference, in the last panel, several doctors coming from the United States mentioned, that triage is going on in, certain areas, in especially Black hospitals, or many Black people are being treated. And there is this unbelievable video, which is going viral since a while, where a Black doctor who is lying in the hospital having COVID is describing how the hospital authorities want to send her home over the weekend, despite the fact that she's obviously in need of treatment and has no care at home, and describing her being triaged, and 3 days later she is dead. Now that brings up the question that, the Western establishment has not been willing so far to completely throw out the privatization policy in respect to healthcare, to, reflect the fact that the reason why the West is so much less able to deal with COVID than the Asians is because the neoliberal policy of privatization has been running the policy for several decades. And, they're closing hospitals while the pandemic is going on. So I think that is a very serious matter and should be corrected, and people must mobilize because this policy kills people.
And while we're talking about this obvious lack of empathy with poor people, the lack of concern with the loss of human lives, one of the points that you've made repeatedly is that this is a cultural question. It's of course an economic question because they're choosing to do things that will kill people. But the lack of response to it comes from the destruction of culture. And we're seeing very just unbelievable kinds of comments. I mean, you were just reporting to me earlier about this attack on Mozart and Beethoven as racist music. This is really out of control, isn't it?
Well, this is really the same policy like we had it with the Congress of Cultural Freedom, so-called, which was this gigantic CIA program in the post-war period to try to attack classical culture, because the oligarchy knows perfectly well that it is the beauty of classical culture in music, in poetry, in painting, which gives people this inner strength, the access to their own creativity, to their own goodness. The more noble parts of themselves is being, evoked through classical culture. So if Oxford University is now having this campaign to attack European music coming from the age of slavery, and then they attack Mozart and Beethoven. I mean, that's exactly this kind of oligarchical motivation which is behind it. And a similar attack we had recently by one Arno Wittmann in Frankfurter Rundschau, who had the nerve to attack Dante, whose 700th anniversary we have this year. And his claim in the Divine Commedia, that he would dare to say which people are good people and which people are bad people and therefore deserve to be either in hell or go to paradise. I mean, if you attack the ability to differentiate if something is good or bad, then you are in the neoliberal chaos we experience right now. But let me come back to one other aspect, and that is that, talking about no culture, one of the forces which are the most loudmouthed in the attacks against China and Russia are not accidental the Greens. The Greens in Germany in particular, but also other Greens. And if you then look at, that most of these people, the older ones, come from the period of the 68ers, and the 68ers had a very clear orientation towards the Maoist cultural revolution in China. Many of them at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s were involved in the so-called K groups. In Germany, they were called K groups because you had a whole bunch of, communist groups, KBW, KBW Nord, KBW, all kinds of different differentiations. And, many of them, like Jürgen Trittin, Joschka Fischer, Bütikofer, who is now sanctioned in response to the European attack on Xinjiang, in my view, absolutely urgently necessary to have occurred. All of these people were really, completely pro-cultural revolution. When the Red Guards in China were let loose by the Gang of Four, taking down the cultural palaces, painted the summer palace in Beijing red, ripped people out of their sleep. I mean, I have been in China in 71, and I got first-hand reports from some people how the Red Guards terrorized the population. This was a period, where the principles of Chinese history were turned upside down. And fortunately, after 10 years, that reign of terror ended after Mao died and the Gang of Four was basically put out of power, and after Deng Xiaoping started the reform and opening up policy, which put China on the course of the present development, which has created this absolutely unparalleled economic miracle, which we have witnessed for the last 40 years. But the difference is that China was able to make an absolute break with this policy of the Cultural Revolution. This is what Deng Xiaoping did. But the problem is that these SDS members, these 68ers who were so fond of the Cultural Revolution, they never changed. They started the long march through the institution. That's how people like Joschka Fischer came from a street fighter with very dubious events, which some people still remember, to become the foreign minister of Germany. This is how Bütikofer became a member of the European Parliament, and Trittin became the environmental minister, and many other such examples can be seen. These older ones became turncoats, and that is why it is no accident that now the Green Party is exactly on the same line like the military-industrial complex of the Pentagon and of NATO in pushing the Great Reset as a priority number one. So I can only urge people who think that they have an anti-war um, conviction or that they are part of the left, that they should reflect on the fact, how does it come that the Green Party is exactly saying and pushing the same policies like the US Pentagon and like NATO in respect to China, in respect to Russia, in respect to the Great Reset. Now, that all has its origin in this cultural revolution orientation of the older Greens, who were then replaced by, pure careerists, like, the present leadership of the Greens, who I don't think have any problem in going with the wind. And I wouldn't even, accuse them of having deeper convictions, because they think that that is how they can prosper in the best way. But people should, should really reflect on that, because I think that the difference is China is successful because they broke with this policy. And if these people like Habeck and Baerbock and others would ever become part of the government in Germany, it would be the downfall of Germany for sure, because these policies would be a complete dismantling of Germany and actually other states in Europe who go along with the same policy, and really be the end of Europe as an industrial continent.
I think what you just went through is extremely important because this gets at the question of the phony creation of left versus right in the US, Democrats versus Republicans, the role of political parties to distort the fact that you do have a unified picture coming from the City of London, from the corporate cartels, from Wall Street, pushing these policies. And it's not a coincidence that, as you said, former General Austin, who is the Defense Secretary of the United States, said that the green policy, that combating climate change is the number one priority of the US military. Now, in this context, Helga, we're now getting out the pamphlet, The Great Leap Backward, to expose the ideological background and the financial and military industrial complex networks behind it. I wonder if you could just say something about that, because I think everyone watching this should get this pamphlet, read it, get extra copies and circulate it so that we can win this fight.
Yes, what this pamphlet really, without any, room for doubt, shows that this, behind all of this great reset and Green Deal, new Green Deal, is the City of London, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and their effort to have one last super boom by pumping 50, 60 trillion dollar into a new bubble where the rich become more rich. Larry Fink and Jamie Dimon will become even bigger billionaires, but the majority of the population in the whole world will pay the bill or die as a consequence, because it will lead to a reduction of population worldwide, because it will destroy the industrial base which is necessary for people to survive. So this is Malthusianism. This goes back to the evil priest Malthus, who said, there is sometimes excess population you have to get rid of. This is the policy of the British East India Company in modern clothes. And I think people really have to understand where this comes from. But I think, some forces are waking up. You have the counterattack by 12 attorney generals in 12 different states in the United States, who have now sued these executive orders coming from Biden to implement this. But I think very important also is that India is now saying that they will, maybe go along with it for 2060, but not at the expense of development. And that is very good, because I remember in 2009 when there was the Copenhagen Climate Summit in Copenhagen, the G77 and the non-aligned movement afterwards made press conferences where they said they are not signing the suicide pact. And obviously, this Indian opposition, which also at the time in 2009 gave the non-aligned movement and the G77 backing, so that they had the courage to do that. Obviously, this worries the present powers to be in such a way that John Kerry, the special climate czar of the Biden administration, has been deployed to India to talk to them about it. And he also goes to some Gulf states afterwards. So we have to watch this. But I think people realize that this is an effort to regulate everything in the direction of a green dictatorship, which will make life impossible for billions of people. So I think this great reset can be defeated, and it can be replaced by an alliance for development, which is needed. We need European countries and the United States, hopefully, to work with Russia, China, India, to develop Southwest Asia, to develop Africa, Latin America, and say no to this policy of genocide, because there you find the genocide and not in Xinjiang.
And people can contact us at the LaRouche organization to get copies of the pamphlet, The Great Leap Backward. And also, Helga, in the context of what you said on culture, the first panel of the Schiller Institute conference last March 20th on a cultural renaissance, what's required, was absolutely essential. And I'd urge people to go to theschillerinstitute.com and watch that and see if you're not moved by the beautiful culture that's presented, and more importantly, by the image of man that's represented by that. So, Helga, unless you have anything else, I think we've covered a lot. We'll see you next week.
Yes, have a good time till next week.